questions to ask, and those are the questions that are most often asked and most often justify working on a project. My interest as a professional, one of the reasons I work in my own company and a small company, is I'm interested in projects that benefit all living things, not just people. Sure, we got to benefit people. We have to get things funded. We have to get things prioritized, justified, etc. But a project like this is more. It's more than just how does this benefit the community, the human community, the city of Blaine, the surrounding area, the recreational uses, or even the environmental uses of like water conservation and habitat restoration and open space management, those kind of things. It's also about all of the plants and animals that use the system that are currently really under a lot of stress and becoming more and more scarce and being overrun by a very small group of other more invasive, more aggressive type species. So just keep that in mind. So anyway, I got my degree, my master's degree in restoration, landscape architecture, restoration ecology in the mid-90s. I would guess that's probably about the time when maybe late 90s you guys were, most of you were born in the late 90s, right? 2001, okay, early 2000s. So I'm used to working with some college kids right around now. So yeah, so I've been doing this for a while. And so today, what I want to talk to you about is the natural history of this site, but not just this site, this entire landscape called the Anoka Sandplain. Have any of you heard of the Anoka Sandplain? All right, I see one. Anyone else? Okay. So it's thinking about this relatively small site in the context of its natural history, both spatially large, like the Anoka Sandplain, which is 1 million acres in size, but also thinking about it in a large temporal scale or time frame. Like this site, the restoration of the site is happening over a decade or two. I've been working on this for 20 years, but this system's been forming and changing for millennia, and most importantly, the last maybe 12,000 years is what really formed the system. I want to talk a little bit about that so you understand its context of where it came from, where it was at when we started working on it, and where we're trying to kind of drive it towards, kind of back to the way that it was. This idea of restoration ecology, what is that? And what are the components of restoration ecology, and how does that apply to the site? So what are the methods that we're using to restore this wetland complex and try to maintain it in a high quality condition, high diversity condition? Why is the site important? I already touched on that a little bit, but we'll talk more about that. And then finally, kind of why I'm here today, in part, is to figure out if there's opportunities and potential for you as students and interest as you as students to participate in the restoration, monitoring, assessment, kind of tracking of changes on the site, and why is that important? So I think there's some opportunities for that. I have this PowerPoint. It's set up, I've given lots of talks about this landscape, and this site, and other sites, and I've got all these slides, and I'm probably going to jump around. So I'm definitely not linear. I'm left-handed, but I do everything else with my right hand. That's one thing. I'm dyslexic. I got lots of things going on, so I do not follow straight lines. I tend to kind of go all different directions. And I think this next slide kind of, this is a slide I put together for a recent talk, and this kind of is the body of work that I work on. And this, all these components of ecology and biology and policy and regulations, all those things apply to this site. And I won't go too much into it, but they all kind of, this is a big feedback loop, and all these cogs on this wheel all kind of feed back to each other. So this site includes historical data, and data for the last 100 years has been collected, and it's significant biologically, ecologically, based on the historical data. I'll talk more about that. There's rare species on the this site, and there's potential for additional rare species, mostly plants, to occur on this site. And I'll talk some about that, but I've been studying these rare plants again for a couple decades of the Anoka sampling. I've been doing my own modern surveys. So I've been looking for plants that were documented 100 years ago in Fridley, say in Moore Lake and Fridley, and right around this area, that were presumed to be extirpated from the state. There were no records for like 50 years, and then in the late 90s, I started to re-find remnant populations of these plants. Continue to do that, and then applied field research and going out in the field and figuring out where do these elements that we want to restore in a landscape, what components of the landscape all come together to form the habitats where these things occur, and figure out what that is, and then look at the larger landscape and say, well, how frequently do those things come together, and what do we need to do when we find a spot like that to restore it so we can have these rare elements in perpetuity or sustainably on the landscape. And that's involved with this site. This site is also a wetland mitigation bank. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, two things. In Minnesota, there's a rare species law, which isn't the case in every state. And in Minnesota, there's a really pretty progressive wetland law that says if you impact a wetland, you have to replace a wetland, and usually it's 2 to 1. So if you impact an acre of this certain type of wetland, you have to usually replace it with 2 acres of wetland. And so it's called the Minnesota Wetland Conservation Act, and it provides incentives and priority or opportunities to create credits or banks that have a lot of monetary value. So the city of Lane and I have been working together to develop the site as a wetland bank so that the credits that are generated from the restoration and preservation of the site can be used to offset losses to wetlands elsewhere in Blaine and throughout the landscape. And then I have this other thing, which is a GIS model, which I actually talk about a little bit, but I'm working on, it's that idea of figuring out what's special about these sites in Blaine and elsewhere, are reference sites, and where else, how commonly do they occur in the Anoka sampling for, many years ago, 100 years ago, prior to settlement, and how common do we think they are today, and where might they be? And so I've been working on that really broad scale modeling. And how many of you have used a GIS, Geographic Information System? You have anyone else? All right. Well, if you are interested in computers and you're interested in ecology and biology, I highly recommend that you learn how to use a GIS. Why? Because there's a lot of jobs in GIS, and it's not just applied to natural resources, but that's one of the more common applications of a GIS. And it's a layering, it's a computer essentially model that layers different aspects of an environment or a landscape, and you can run analyses based on the interaction of those layers, and it's real powerful. All right, so see, I told you I could talk. I can talk about this for a long time, but I want this to be pertinent. I want it to be interesting, so I'll try to get through some of this relatively quickly. The site 7, we call it a wetland sanctuary, is down here in Anoka, southern Anoka County, really where we are in a state scale. And this is the ecological classification system for Minnesota with the ecological subsections. And you have a prairie biome, you have a deciduous forest biome, and then a boreal forest biome. And then within those biomes, you've got different subsections. We are in the Anoka sampling, which is this area shaded in light green R. And I'm going to talk a bit about the Anoka sampling. It's about 1 million acres in size, 1.1 million acres. And this is kind of highlighting where it is and where we are. And then because I'm from New Jersey, and because we have this thing called the New Jersey Pine Barrens in New Jersey, which is an ecological preserve. Who knew there was a preserve in New Jersey? But there is. And it's a good part of southern New Jersey, and it's about 1 million acres in size. Well, here's the state of Minnesota and the state of New Jersey to scale right next to each other. And then there's the Anoka sandplain and the pinelands to scale, and they're about the same size. However, Minnesota has 87,000 square miles and a population of 5.3 million. New Jersey has a tenth the size, 8,700 square miles, and 8.8 million people crunched in to that small space. And most of the population of New Jersey is concentrated in the northern half, where I'm from. But what is that? Why is that significant? It means that in the Anoka sandplain, it's a large landscape that has relatively low pressures on it compared to other preserves or other biosphere preserves, that kind of thing, elsewhere in the country. There's a lot of opportunities here still for restoration compared to other parts of the country. So this is the geology, superficial geology of the Anoka sandplain. So it's this 1.1 million acre area, and it's got this odd shape that kind of follows the Mississippi River. But really what it is it's a large old glacial lake plain. And so when the glaciers were coming down from the north and receding, coming down and receding, they were pushing material all along what is now the Mississippi River. And right around this part, if you go just south and west of here, there's ridges, and those ridges were the banks of this glacial lake. And that glacial lake, it oscillated in size and it moved around, but it was about 50 to 100 feet deep. So where we're standing was under, say, 50 feet of water. Okay, and this, what we're looking out on is a old lake bed. And so it had different episodes, but every time it would drain, it would either drain through the St. Croix River or drain through the Mississippi River. It would outlet, that dam would rupture, and it would outlet, and it would shift around, and it would scour these channels. And in these channels here is really where the wetland sanctuary was formed, in one of these channels. So it was the bottom of a lake bed, and it was like the scour channel from an outlet. And this next slide shows the vegetation that was mapped at the time of Minnesota's settlement, about 1850s. And it also shows corresponding, I have it in the same color, those channels, they formed peat deposits. That's what that previous slide showed. Everything in pink there is a peat deposit in one of those channels. And you guys were out there squishing the peat right in your hands. And that peat is, in some places, 20 feet deep, okay, accumulating less than a millimeter a year for 6,000 years, okay, 20 feet. So that's how long it's taken to form that system. And then on top of that peat, back 150 years ago, before the highways and the developments and everything and fire suppression and all that stuff, what was out in those peats was a sea of wet meadow, a sea of sedge meadow. And that's really what we're trying to restore big parts of this system to. Have you guys, did they walk out into the center, into the sedge meadow, like the wiregrass? I mean, that's what was in all these peatlands. Nowadays, when you go and visit these peatlands, a lot of them are fragmented and they're developed around. There's highways. I mean, Moore Lake in Fridley's got a Highway 65 going right through it. And so it's all fragmented and broken up. And so to have a site like the Wetland Sanctuary that's 510 acres in size, peatland with islands and woods and openings, that's pretty rare nowadays, especially this close to, say, the core cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so this is just some of my initial work looking at rare plant populations associated with these habitats. And it just so happens that a constant reason I've worked in Blaine and down this way is that in the late 90s and early 2000s is when I found a whole bunch of these rare plants all occurring in these peatlands in the southern part of the Anoka sandplain. And so when you look at this, just this overlay of rare plants on top of superficial geology, you can say these areas of pink and purple are the peat deposits, and they're starting to return a lot of rare plant populations, and oh, here are some other areas that might be suitable for those same habitats. But when you look at the Anoka sand plain as a whole, how much of it is really pink and purple? Not a whole lot of it, maybe 15% of it, and most of that's concentrated right down here in the Blaine, Lina Lakes, kind of Columbus area, Ham Lake.
Hey Jason?
Yes?
Before you, can you go back to that slide?
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, because where, the edge of that plain, that area up in the far left corner, whereabouts is that? I can't really.
Up in here?
Yeah, where are we in
So-
the state there?
So this is up by like St. Cloud.
Okay, about
It's
60.
quite a ways. Yeah, this is like Sherburne County, and you can start to see the county outlines. I've got some better, but this is Mille Lacs County,
Okay.
the south end, or right there's the south end. And yeah, this is right up about here's like Little Falls and St. Cloud,
Okay, thank you.
Sartell area. So this is a recent figure that I put together, and it shows at a really relatively large scale, and that kind of shows, so here's the sand plain again, Benton County, Sherburne County, like you were asking, but this shows the 3 major episodes of the glacial lake that formed all of these deposits. And the first one was Glacial Lake Lind, which started all the way up in Carlton, up by Duluth. That's how big that lake was, and it drained down through here and scoured this channel out right through southeastern Anoka County, and that's why you see on that previous map all of these peat deposits. It scoured this huge channel out, which slowly filled with water, which slowly filled with plant material, 1 millimeter per year for 6,000 years, and developed these peat deposits. It's pretty incredible. So, what does that look like at a scale we can really think about? All right. Well, this is the north end of the wetland sanctuary, what we call the Site 7 wetland bank, and just for reference, the boardwalk kind of goes like this that you walked on between Lexington and the lakes. And out in there's these islands, which the purple are these upland sandy islands with the forests on them. Then there's these benches of Isanti wet soils, and then marky mucks, which are not marky mark, but marky mucks. They're the shallower peats, maybe 4 to 6 feet of peat, and then these rifle mucks, which are the 20 feet deep of peat. So there's quite a large marky muck deposit out there, and a marky muck, and then a rifle muck. So anyway, that's just the depths. And what does that look like, say, in cross section? That's what that starts to look like. You have these Zimmerman dry islands with the oaks and the other trees on them, and then you have these Isanti like benches, which are saturated, and then you get down into the rifle mucks and the marky mucks, the deeper peats and things like that. And then underlaying all that is the sand that is the lake bottom, that only the sand really stuck around, and when the lakes outletted, all the clay and silt, all the fine particle stuff went right down the rivers to the ocean. So I've mapped some of this. This is at Pioneer Park. This shows I've mapped. This is the surface of the peat. So even the surface of the peat is undulating. It's not completely flat. There's like maybe 6 to 12 inches of undulation on top. But when you map through probing down to the bottom, through the peat to the sand on a grid, I'm able to map out the depth of the sand and what it does underneath. And you'd think, oh, it's flat on top, so it's going to be flat on the bottom. But no, underneath the sand is undulating, and some of that has to do with the way it was scoured, and some of it has to do with the way the winds blew sand around before the landscape was vegetated after the lake bed was drained. And then this is a sketch that I've done. Just a quick drawing that shows again the forested uplands. And what is the hydrology of the site? An understanding of the hydrology of the site is that water falls in these sandy uplands, hits a confining layer, and goes laterally, very shallowly, over to these basins. And those basins are saturated for most of the year, and they're anaerobic and they form peat over millennia. And then there's even some water chemistry changes between the middle of this peatland and the edges, meaning that the edges are getting some minerals off of the sandy uplands, like just things like nitrogen and carbon and magnesium, those kind of things. And so the plant community on the edges are going to be different and less acidic than the center. You're going to have mostly just rain-fed center and snowmelt centers to these things. And that's where you get things like sundews and pitcher plants, these acid-loving plants that are carnivorous and things like that. And there are some sundews out there as well in the center where the pH starts to get to be slightly acidic. All right. At this point, I think I might. So we do vegetation sampling out there, and we look at both the species diversity within a plot, but we're also looking at structure. And as we restore a site, we're taking it from maybe wooded or shrubby back down to herbaceous with wildflowers and things like that. So the cover and abundance of species is important, as well as just the list of species. I'm just going to show you real quick that we did do a model. It was a 3 million acre model of the Anoka sand plains, so that we understand not just what's going on in the site at Site 7 or at the sanctuary, but that we understand its relative importance, its relative rarity within the larger landscape of the sand plain in Minnesota. And so instead of just assuming that it's rare or assuming that it's common, we actually quantitatively look at kind of where are the opportunities within this landscape. And we did that by looking at, known rare plants that were associated with these types of habitats and associating those with the soil types, and then modeling the soil types over this really large 3 million acre area. This is all done in GIS. And what this starts to show, at least in part, is that anywhere that's like a heat map, anywhere that's this bright red and orange color, is the area of the sand plain where this habitat has some potential to occur. And that also coincides with the superficial geology slide I showed you, where the pinks and purples, where the peat is, and that's really what this is showing. So this landscape that we're restoring in Blaine isn't everywhere. It's only in the Anoka sand plain, and as soon as you get outside of the sand plain into the kind of buffer area, it really just, the potential for it really falls apart. So it's unique to the sand plain, and it's mostly constricted to the southern Anoka sand plain. So it's a really small area in this large state of Minnesota. It's a really unique kind of system. I'm just going to skip these slides, but this model output shows also that anywhere, this is the city of Blaine, and here's our, here's 109th and Lexington. So this is the wetland sanctuary north end, and it shows that everywhere shaded in green and within the city of Blaine has the potential for these species to occur and for these sites to be restored. And so, and everywhere in red shows where that used to occur in Blaine and is now paved over, developed over, or what have you. And everywhere in that's clear, you can see through, never was that kind of system. But you can see about half of those areas in the city of Blaine are lost to development. And the remainder are the green shaded areas. We know this from this model, and that there's very few contiguous places where there's large contiguous places of green left in Blaine. And when you overlay a city publicly owned map of land, right, this area right here would probably be the only publicly owned large area left shaded in green, where this system used to occur, where we can still restore it, and then it's publicly owned. So it starts to show where the opportunities are for a conservation project like this to really protect and restore an important, kind of unusual system for Minnesota. All right, so this shows direct impacts, and you can see underneath, like here's the airport, and here's the lakes development, which used to be a sod farm, which used to be a peatland, right? And this is all when I started tromping around in the mid-90s, this was all sod farm with ditches through it, and that sod was growing on peat that was partially drained. So that just shows the direct kind of human impacts to this kind of system in the city of Blaine. But there's some other maybe more subtle things going on here that whether you're studying these for 20 years or whether you're 17 years old, you might not know because you haven't really been thinking about this in a large scale. So this is a part of the city of Blaine, a photo from the city of Blaine in 1938, okay? That was just that was before I was born too, okay? And this shows what the landscape in northern Blaine looked like. This is Radisson Road, and this is Main Street, okay? And if any of you are familiar with Pioneer Park, this is Pioneer Park, which is pretty wooded right now in its current state. So that shows how, and all these blobs are trees, and all the kind of lighter colors are open fields and open wetlands and things like that. But it shows how relatively agricultural, undeveloped, and open, meaning not a lot of closed canopy forest type things going on, the landscape was. And a large part of that was in this sandy, peaty landscape prior to human settlement. Fires would start on this really dry soil in this really prairie-dominated, open-grown oak kind of system, and it would just roll right through. And it would roll through every maybe 3 to 5 to 8, 10 years. I mean, that often. And when it started, there was nothing to stop it. There was no Spring Lake Park Fire Department. There was no reason. There was nobody here except the Native Americans. And the Native Americans even managed parts of the landscape with fire for hunting and for foraging and things like that. Because after a fire, some of the plants, or many of the plants of this landscape, will flower prolifically and produce fruit, abundant fruit, after a fire. And so the Native Americans would set this landscape on fire as well, just for hunting and gathering purposes and management. So we know all this from looking at cores and from studying soil profiles. You can see the charcoal, you can see how, just like rings in a tree, you can see how often a landscape burned, especially in the peatlands. You can see that. And so anyway, 1938, this is 80 years ago, right? This landscape was open and fire driven, fire evolved. And then the roads came in, and then the houses came in, and the farms, and the subdivisions, and the high school, and all. And now, when a fire starts anywhere, even if it's out in a wetland, what happens? Gets put out right away, right? We can't have fires burning around without any reason or just burning wherever they want. And so after that happens, everything starts to close up, okay? And so this is Pioneer Park. The wetland at Pioneer Park, there's another peatland there. This is an upland island, which used to be, now it's all closed oaks. If you've been in northern Pioneer Park and walked those trails, this is big oaks that are all closed canopy. It used to be open canopy. But at the time it was closed, it was open, everything was open. And that's 1938, 1964, 26 years later. Look at the landscape, fire suppression, and the kind of the abandonment of agriculture, and what happens? The landscape starts to close up. And meanwhile, people are being born in 1964, and they're being raised in the 60s and raised in the 70s, and they're saying, well, what is Blaine like? Blaine is a wooded landscape. This is the way it's always been, right? But no, I mean, I had the same experience in New Jersey. I just thought this is the way New Jersey always was, but it had been cut over like a dozen times by the time I was born. And so just in a matter of 36 years, not even 26 years, excuse me, it went from that to that, right? And so that has a profound effect on the biodiversity of this site, but also of the landscape. And it has a profound effect on the perceptions of everybody being born and raised and living, residing, and doing work in the landscape. And so what we've been doing, this is the same circle, but from looking at it from a slight, this is Main Street, so we're looking at it from the north. What we've been doing is kind of clearing some of these peatlands of vegetation, but clearing them prior to burning them with the intent of releasing all of the native seeds and native propagules that are there, and studying what happens, and looking at the effect of clearing on these systems, and then after that running fire through them. This is just a few examples of a couple of slices of the landscape in Blaine that show this kind of, that same soil profile where you had the peat in the center, and then these benches that were saturated, and then these dry uplands. But now the benches, instead of being herbaceous and saturated, are wooded, and the center, the peaty centers tend to be kind of sporadically treed, but overgrown with native invasive grasses, excuse me. And then all the sandy uplands tend to be farmed or developed. And this is the Blaine, Anoka County Airport in Blaine, showing how complex the soil patterning was through there, creating this expression of vegetation. But again, it's the same pattern with fire suppression. It's getting very woody, very closed off, and all of these plants that are rare and all these diverse systems are becoming like single species systems and being shaded out and fire suppressed, and it's converting to a whole different type of landscape. I think, does anyone have any questions? Do you want me to keep going on this track, or? All right, okay. So I'm going to show you some examples of, these are the guys back in the 20s, 1920s. This is what a botanist, this is what I would have looked like back in the 20s. The botanists would go out from Minneapolis and drive their Model Ts, I guess, 10 or 15 miles was a long trip up the really pretty poor roads up to Anoka County, and they would botanize, the gentleman botanists, they would botanize in their suits and with their pipes, and they would collect plants and they would press the plants and they would put those at the university. And these are the same plants that I am looking at today, the actual pressed plants with their handwritten labels that kind of tipped me off to what was going on 100 years ago now, 1920s, 100 years ago. What was going on? And there were little dribs and drabs of these rare plants associated with these peatlands around Moore Lake and around up in Blaine and up at Cedar Creek. And back in 1999, I found this plant growing. It had only been found about 6 times ever in the state, and I found it growing up at Pioneer Park in Blaine in this kind of scraped out little ditch. And what happened was the city had scraped out in the 80s this ditch out through the peat and exposed the seeds to this plant, and there were thousands of them. And this plant, the Xyris torta, twisted yellowgrass, hadn't been seen in the state since 1967. It had been like 30 years since anyone had seen this in the state of Minnesota, and here were thousands of them. And I went back to the records from these botanists from the 20s, and I figured out kind of what it was and what it was going on. Okay, and this plant happens to be at the Blaine Wetland Sanctuary, out in the center. If you walked out in the center, where it was kind of slightly raised and saturated, and the vegetation was real low and real diverse, and lots of rubus and things like that. This plant is, there's a population of that plant. It's getting bigger with restoration, but that's one of 10 populations in the state of that plant, and only since the late 90s that we've been able to find. And so these are just kind of some of the original records of these things. I won't get into that, but like I said, there's rare species law in Minnesota, and then there's a rare species or tract in Minnesota. Like, so there's an entire field of study and of regulation, and that what we know is that this Anoka sandplain landscape has 114 listed species in the Anoka sandplain. more than any other subsection in the state. And many of those happen to be plants. 52 happen to just be plants. And many of those plants either occur or could occur in these peatlands in Blaine. And this is just a distribution map of where all the rare things are in the Anoka sandplain, but then in the landscapes immediately adjacent to the sandplain. So it's this place where great diversity can happen. And then down in the southern part of the sandplain is a hot spot, but then also over here, this is the Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge. That's why there's lots of records there. Okay, what's kind of, this is the rare plants of these shallow groundwater influenced wetlands and peatlands, and I won't go too much in that, but I'll show you some photos of those. There's a ton of them. And what happens to be the case is that coincidentally, this is more of a national map for, or an upper Midwestern map for Xyris torta, that same twisted yellow-eyed grass that we found in Pioneer Park. But it happens that it's a eastern coastal plain disjunct. And what does that mean? It means that back, again, when the glaciers were receding 10,000 years ago, the Great Lakes were attached to the east coast through an intercoastal waterway. They still kind of are. There's a ribbon of canals and things like that. But I'm talking about a big inland sea that connected glacial lakes to the east coast. And what happened was the plants that were occurring on the east coast below the extent of the glaciers migrated in that inland seaway and made it out to the Midwest over thousands of years. And then those connections dried up, and there are these remnant populations of these sandplain species that occur in these wetlands out in Blaine. And that's what Xyris torta is. And there's other examples of that. Here's another eastern coastal plain disjunct. This one species of pondweed happens to occur pretty abundantly on the east coast, but only sporadically in the Midwest, and that connection is from a glacial waterway connection 10,000 years ago. Here's me in a field of that Xyris torta, another site in Blaine. This is probably one of the larger populations in the state, tens of thousands of plants. It's only about knee-high, and one of the rare plants in the entire state of Minnesota. I think I'm going to skip, I'll skip that slide. In addition to doing the surveys for these plants, and a site like this is really important for understanding where they are and where they could be. Every time we collect a plant, it's not just collect a plant, press it, put it in the herbarium or the museum at the U. It's collect incredibly a detailed amount, a lot of detail information about that population and that plant, so that unlike the records from 100 years ago, when I look at the handwritten notes, it might say Xyris torta, wet meadow, Ham Lake. That's all they gave me, right? So nowadays it's paragraphs of information, latitude, longitude, associated species, soils, moisture, slope and aspect, all that stuff, really concise information, so that 100 years from now, when somebody reads my label, they can close their eyes and envision what I saw versus just having to guess. And so this is I did a study on the tubercle ringed orchid. So there are orchids out in this site, not tubercle ringed orchid, but Pioneer Park there are. And when I'm looking and studying a plant, I'm not just going out to find it, like wandering around, needle in a haystack. Oh, I got lucky, I found it. I'm using all of this information to help me dial in on areas of the landscape to find these things. And so anytime I find these things, I want to collect information on all of these things. I won't read them all off to you, but you can read them. There's a lot of stuff. I'll consider every aspect of these characteristics and collect information so that I can feed that back into the system so that the next person can learn. And that's really the scientific method right there. Okay, so here is tubercle ringed orchid, and like I said, this is at Pioneer Park in Blaine, and really ought to be at the wetland sanctuary, but it might take some burning and it might take some other restoration to get that to show up. It's a green.
Jason,
Yes.
let's just take a quick break. We're gonna have the kids passing, so
Okay.
give the kids a break. Why don't
Yeah.
you guys go get a drink of water and wander around over there in the cafeteria for a minute, or get up and move around, and we'll come back in about 9 or 10 minutes. Okay?
Sounds good. Great.
What time we going to? 45? Okay. I'll go through the plants and I'll go through those.
Follow through to the main office, please. Kevin Lamette, Janet Romero, Katie Ford, Kevin Olson. Once again, Kevin Olson, Katie Ford, Janet Romero, Kevin Lamette. Main office, please pick up items.
You're beautiful. You're beautiful. Love you.
Go and then, yeah, then come on back when you're done.
Ah! Stretch.
Yes.
Would it be too obscene to see
There's a lot of
I'm just,
Never mind, it's arm day.
I'm saying neither one of these stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But there's so much that's interesting to listen to.
If you're not a football player, so like we do like we list 4 days a week. You fill in notes. Oh, yeah, I think I have to wait.
Oh, right.
Big.
every 3 seconds.
What? So you're like, one?
Yeah.
All the different, you know, just like what you're saying in the pictures, of course, my
I don't know. Just start to stop. Ew! No, we do those in karate.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Why does he
Yeah.
go?
No free riding places.
It's like bench press. Ew, that's a hard one.
Complex, yeah.
Big.
That's from the Dayton Mall.
You're so.
Try doing that for a couple hours.
I can't like
I gotta say, like,
get on the ladder and like saw like a tree branch and stick that here. Yeah, it's the worst.
Yeah.
I love like yard work is my thing. I love yard work. It's really fun to do. It's athletically pleasing. Except that getting a sawzall and pushing a ladder.
Janet Romero, Kevin Olson.
No.
Main office,
With a
Kevin
sawzall,
Olson,
yeah.
Janet
I
Romero,
hate it.
Kevin
Hate it.
Lamette. Main office, please.
Oh, that's fine. See, I can do that. A sawzall freaks me out. Yeah. It's a mechanical, wiry thing above your head.
In Mexico,
they got pine tree?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I get pine tree.
Yeet! You know, yeet.
basically,
Yeah.
so we can have 6 feet of whatever,
Lopping off.
both sides, it's round up, anything you can put out.
Yeah, yeah, you just.
So what I'm doing is at the last thing, I'm gonna take it down one because I'm not like that. I've always wanted to sell an axe.
Love felling axes with my boys. Chuck. I still have some. What's this? Oh my gosh.
Sorry.
And everything. Profile.
Freaking. A lot of this is like over my head. I'm like, okay, guys, wetlands. It's like Tuesday. It's almost like
But there are certain
I
ones
don't even know what
That's
the
what it is.
Timmy's cheating.
He's a cheater. What do you expect?
What?
My sister's like, hey, you know how like graphics are school to
Wait. Hold her. How old is she? They do? Kind of shook. Okay. Why don't you just come inside with me? Oh wait, did she play softball with her? Let's just get you back in and just again. No. Yeah, why would you just
Exactly.
make it work? I don't like TI-83. Thank you very much. I think I do. Oh my god, my body doesn't just stretch. It's agitating. Do you ever just like stretch? You never like sit?
I can't reach myself.
Oh.
I'm trying, Timmy.
Right now, so.
I can't.
So.
I can't. You know, Alana did it during tap day. Yeah. Freaking Alana did it. So we choreographed an entire like tap number, right? And then Alana's group freaking finishes doing the splits. Oh my god. I'm like, okay, you can help. Oh, that's a lot harder than that.
This is about as far as I can go.
That's a rip and a half, let me tell you.
No, I will.
Ah.
Man, she's not seeing the splits.
We what? Sexy. Why keep this Ew. That's really gross.
Oh.
Yeah. I was longer than I was out there, so.
Whoa. Tired.
No, I didn't even think I
This is supposed to be a long section.
Montana or Alaska. But I just made too many. And the combination of that, this is an economic development, there's a lot of opportunities in the state. And but there's also to practice with still very wild. And there's a lot of natural resources. You know, the Dakotas are nice and wild, but there's no economic development, and there's no resources.
I don't swear it. There's a tree. I saw it last week.
Yeah, resources lie right. Montana is all wide open, undeveloped, but no.
I like trees.
Alright. Alright, we're ready to go?
Yeah.
You got a little break, breather,
Freaking
couple
upset.
push-ups. Ready
Yeah,
to go.
Alright.
Thank you.
Okay,
I actually do have a question though.
all right, shoot,
Alright, let's go back to the fire thing.
yeah.
And suppressing fires and the open canopy, closed canopy. If fires are a great way to clear out old vegetation and then bring in new seeds and make new vegetation. And it looks like we're slicing and dicing some of our closed canopy stuff to make room for some vegetation and to preserve other forms of vegetation. And I wondered why we're just not like setting fires in the fence right now, if like that's a good place to start.
Oh, in the fence? Well, for one, one of the reasons is that the vegetation that's come in under the suppressed condition is so thick, even the herbaceous, the grasses and things, are so thick and matted down that, and they're wet, And so you can run a fire through that, but it's gonna skip right over, it's like a mulch or like a coconut fiber fabric. It's wet, and it's just, the fire just, it's a great question, and I'm gonna get to that. But it skips right over the top of that, and all you get is just more of that grass. And so, and then the methods that I've developed to restore these, to really get at that saturated stuff prior to fire is expensive. And so you have to have a really good reason to do it. And that's why you gotta pick your sites rather than, well, let's try to burn this site, let's try to burn that site. It's part of a big plan that gets developed for like a priority site. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm trying to give you enough the detail, but I also want to bring it back around to like, what can you all do if you're interested in contributing to this project? So I'm gonna maybe skip over some stuff. What time do we wrap up?
55 is when the bell rings to leave
55. I
school.
hope that I'm not still talking at 55. Okay.
Okay.
All right. That's my goal. So anyway, we're back to the threatened tubercle ringed orchid. It's an orchid that's about the size of a pencil eraser, that flower, and it's got a little bump on the lip, tubercle. And that tubercle is supposed to guide the proboscis of mosquitoes, which mosquitoes pollinate this orchid, believe it or not. So when you say, what good are mosquitoes? Well, they pollinate rare orchids right in your backyard. They do.
With the proboscis.
They do, with a proboscis. Here's a lance-leaf violet, a threatened species. It's a regular violet flower, but look at those leaves, are long and linear, kind of interesting. There's these weird sedges which happen to be near and dear to my heart. This is a tall nut rush. There's some of this over right at 95th and right really at the airport. And there's only maybe 4 populations as ever in the state of Minnesota. And there's some right in the southern end of Blaine on both sides of the highway by the water tower over there. It has this really weird white hard seed, and if you can see that over there. The cross-leaved, the leaves are crossed, milkwort. Again, maybe 6 populations of this in the state. This is at Pioneer Park. We haven't seen it yet at the Blaine Wetland Sanctuary, but we anticipate that it'll show up once we start burning. It really needs fire. It's an annual species, so it's not coming up from roots every year. It's got to have its seeds exposed to the sun, and without fire, that's very unlikely to happen. This little thing, again, like you would just probably walk by most of these things, right? I mean, they're really obscure little things, but they're so rare. This is called tooth cup. The flowers those are the fruits in the nodes. The flowers are about 1 millimeter long and really can't even see them with the naked eye. But this is a plant of only 4 populations in the state. There's a population in a restoration I'm doing over in Lino Lakes, which is the biggest known population at Woolens Park in Lino Lakes. Juncus marginatus, this is over in southeastern Blaine. This is a little rush. Again, just so nondescript, but it's a species of the East Coast again, and the Gulf of Mexico, along the coast in Louisiana, down there. It was presumed, it was at Moore Lake and Fridley, and it was presumed, it was only found there one time in the 20s and was presumed extirpated. We've since found it in other places in Blaine, in these restoration sites. This is a little bulrush that flowers in April. I won't go much more on that. And another little sedge that grows in the peaty exposed areas, but it needs the exposed, saturated peat for it to even exist. Another orchid the club spur orchid that was found in the 20s in Anoka County, down at Moore Lake and in Blaine area, and wasn't seen again for another 90 years. We found that just recently at a restoration site up at Cedar Creek Biological Preserve. I think I'm going to skip to the Blaine Wetland Sanctuary, talk about the site itself, the planning. It's a 510-acre site. It has been the vision of certain members of the Natural Resource Board since the 80s they're still on the board. Mary Jo Truchon and Dottie McKinley really kind of dreamed this thing up in the 80s. I came along in the 90s, tried to figure out how to get this kind of going, And it was really the wetland banking plans, the 192 acre banking plan we're working on now, and the other 100 acre bank that we've already established, that really got this thing going. The current bank is this northern part. The existing established bank is this middle part, and we're starting to work on plans for the southern part. Did someone have a question? No? All right. We already talked about kind of the soils, you know, there's those marky mucks and the rifle mucks and things like that. This shows the pre-restoration vegetation, and there's a lot of information there, but what it shows is a lot of fragmentation, and also it doesn't really show quality so much, but it shows a little bit of this and a little bit of that, when really it should just be kind of a pretty broad mosaic of maybe 3 different types of vegetation. And so that's really what we're trying to restore to a wet meadow, really rich in diversity, and then these oak uplands on the islands. This shows topography. Really all this is showing, the blue is all one topo line. It shows that the site's pretty darn flat, maybe with a couple 10 feet of topography at the top of the islands. And it follows that soil katina and this 3-dimensional schematic that I showed with the Zimmerman soils and the Isani soils and the peats. So that's very much at play. And when you walked out there, did you notice how relatively flat the site is? Right? And then just those islands, the oak islands. And so this is the proposed kind of restoration plan. It doesn't look like all that much, because what it's saying is that, yeah, there's going to be a boardwalk, which exists now, and a trail, but really it's going to be these kind of 3-4 major types of vegetation. You got the oaks and the wooded islands. We're going to keep them wooded for the most part, and then you're going to have wet meadow, fringe, and poor fen and rich fen. Those are the 2 kind of slightly different acidity types of a wet meadow, because they're more interior. They're not getting the minerals off the edges of the landscape, and that's just what we know they should be and what we want them to be. This just shows, I did the wetland delineation, so I've walked every inch out here and delineated. It shows where the upland islands are in green, right? And where the wetlands are, the shaded blue. So it's this mosaic, this complex of undulating topography. And in the northern site, this shows where the uplands are compared to wetlands. If you look through the blue shading, this is a pre-restoration photo. I didn't even realize I had, but look how wooded this was before we cleared it. You walk out there now, you can see straight across it, and that some people are very happy about that, but some people are very upset about that. This shows vegetation plots. I have, I think, 16 vegetation plots or so out there, monitoring the pre-restoration diversity and condition and quality of the vegetation, and then monitoring the vegetation stepwise year by year as we restore the site. This is a aerial photo that I took from a plane. I have a drone now, but this is a photo from a plane, I don't know, 10 years ago. This shows that southern island, and just again how the center was kind of open, meaning herbaceous, but pretty choked out even with the grasses and stuff, but just how wooded this had become with the fire suppression. And then this is just my little sketch of, there are the upland islands, here's a poor fen, rich fen, and what's prescribed as wet meadow was very wooded. Had to get all those trees out of there. This just shows the pre-restoration condition and the prescribed restoration condition. So we go and do these plots, and we generate these floristic quality index values where 0 is really bad and maybe 35 or 40 is really high, and I won't get too much into that today, but it has to do with the diversity of species and the relative conservatism or nativeness of the species that comprise that plot or plant community. So we're out there doing the vegetation plots, describing the abundance and cover. We generate very detailed and complex at times lists and of species that are out there. We monitor, most importantly, I think, the percent of the invasive cover versus the percent of the native cover, and want to get the invasive plants down as low as possible. This is that, I'm not going to even go into that. But basically it shows that, again, 0 to 40, that these values in here are really a lot of our plots are starting off down at this lower value area, and we want to get them up into this higher value area. And this kind of shows the reasons, kind of relationships of that formula as to how we would get there. But here's the existing plots, and I'll just mention that, you know, some of these green perimeter areas, they're relatively low, like 9, 9.5, 4, 5. Those are low values. But some of these plots, like the one with the twisted yellow-eyed grass, really diverse, a lot of rare plants and things, that's all the way at 28 points, even before we even started restoring it. And so that's starting at a very high level. So there is some high integrity things out there, and there's some really degraded stuff. And so we want to make the high stuff a little better, but we really want to try to kind of lift the edges of this thing that were affected by the drainage and had so many trees and reed carrier invasive species and things like that. So some of the parts of the site don't really require all that much work, while other parts are going to take a heck of a lot of work to get them to be where we want them to be. Here's some photographs of the tree removal, just to give you an idea. This roughly follows, this would be coming off the island where the boardwalk is now, hooking up onto the island, and then the boardwalk kind of comes up around here, where this is east, and this is north. This shows you just how many trees we took down with a feller buncher, and then had them all chipped up and removed. You can see the lines in the snow, and the lines going this way. That's all from the mowing and the raking. So this is a very large scale operation. Winter, when it's frozen, you'd get stuck out there in the summer. So a lot of this is done in January and February. Here's just a bundle of trees that were taken down with a feller buncher. And then one of the things that I did was I dated not all, various trees of various species within those piles. So I would go out with a Sharpie, and this is actually the center point of it was kind of a lopsided, but I'd count off 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 6 years. So you could really easily count and age the trees. And so you might have a big green ash and a little oak and a huge cottonwood that's 3 feet in diameter. But guess what? They're all about 50 to 60 years old. They all came in 50 to 60 years ago when the landscape started to change. Remember I showed you that photo when it started to shift?
Yeah, okay, that's actually really cool. But where do you draw the line between positive, like, deforestation, but also, like, positive restoration?
Yeah. So deforestation would be, to me, would be this landscape is supposed to support a forest, and we're going to clear cut it for development, for forestry, for whatever. Restoration is about this landscape, peatland, supposed to support a fen or a wet meadow community. It's been fire suppressed, and trees have come in. And these trees are like not a community. They don't form like a known community. They're just volunteer trees. They're fast growing. They're soft wooded. Many of them would be rotted in the middle or whatever. And so that's not, to me, it's clearing a forest, but or clearing of woodland, but it's not deforestation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, is it like a common misconception? I mean, you're in the business of
Yes.
like restoration, preservation, stuff like that. Do people often refute what you're trying to do
Yes.
because they're misinformed on the intent?
We had incredible pushback from the western side, the development that came in, which happened to be developed on a old sod farm, which was an old peatland that they happened to just get exempt from the wetland laws and all that stuff. But there's all those volunteer trees on the edge there, and we started to clear cut on city property all these trees, and that was their view, and they wanted the forested view, and they got very upset. And they still, many of them still don't really want to accept the ecological underpinnings or rational, all the things I've shown you, they don't want to, that was then, that was 100 years ago, or that was 1,000 years ago, and this is now. These trees belong here, period, because we think so. But that's not science.
At that point, the trees are just invasive, right? In a
It,
way.
you could, that's what I would say, but people can either accept that or not, you know, so
Cool.
you present the evidence. Here's some cleared, some example, another photo of the site now that the trees have been all hauled off. This is like, you know, beautiful to me. This is the way, what we're going for. You'll notice this island here, which we intended to clear, is all the trees are up because that was a stop order. These houses got so upset about that. Whereas this island is all oaks. This is aspen and birch and green ash and things like that. And we're going to take that down. And then all that shrub up there, that we couldn't take that down because they had to sort it out politically. But we got everything from the oak island to the east cleared. And we're going to clear the rest of that, I think, this winter. Here's the kind of the trail and the uplands kind of getting put in, but you can still see some of this to the south, some of the shrubs and things like that. And then this is the southern part of the bigger sanctuary that hasn't been restored. You can just see how wooded that is, which we'll probably try to clear as much of that as makes sense. And then there's the piles of thatch. So you asked about, well, why don't you just burn? And it's like, because we have to get this stuff out of the water and get down to the peat. And so we pile the thatch up and we just let it sit there. And then when it sits there, it's in the oxygen and it just breaks down over a few years. And then if we run a fire through it, it'll pretty much burn it up. They tend to disappear. This just shows an air photo, and then this shows kind of the rich fen area. So just a slight, you guys were out there, but it's a slight rise, and you can kind of make it out. Slight rise in the peat, that inflated sponge kind of effect, and that's where some of these rare plants occur. There's me reveling in the glory of clearing the site after 20 years of wanting to do it. Some tools. This is a tool that I designed, and I had my brother-in-law who's a welder fabricator. We made this rake. This rake doesn't exist anywhere else on the earth, and it's specifically for doing this work. And we attach that to a bobcat, and it's pretty effective. It's a small tool, but when enough hours, you can get a lot done. And this is the answer to your question. Even this mowed and even raked, but not down to the peat, this is no good. This is still too thatchy. This, where you have the peat exposed, is going to allow that seed bank to germinate and to express itself and to reproduce. And then we run fire through this condition. Once the fuel is what carries the fire, so it's got to all re-sprout, yes, but it's not the laying down stuff. That's no good. It's got to be up, and then you run a fire through it, and it burns it right back down to the peat, and then we maintain that condition in perpetuity. Every 3 to 5 years burn, and then the site should be pretty good to go.
Okay, I've got another question. This is very interesting. So, okay, you have your own business, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I can't help but think that there are other businesses that are in the right mindset for preservation, but are doing things like this, where they're just leaving thatch, like things that would probably be considered the wrong way of preservation, conservation kind of thing. So, like, what do you think you're doing differently that's improving the environment rather than everyone else who's trying?
So one thing that we're doing is as we are looking at sites to restore, we're applying the scientific method to that site. So we don't just say, we think that we're going to spend $1 million on this site of your money city, and we just think it's going to work. We go out there, we spend $20,000 doing plots or doing strips, and we treat the site. We might burn part of the site, but we just look at subsets, samples of the site, and we look at that. And remember that big wheel with all the cogs and instead of nonlinear thinking? That's what we do. We borrow from all these areas of different fields and the sciences, the applied and the research and ecological science, and we and in botany and plant ecology, and we just we borrow from all of them and we apply aspects of them to implementing projects or testing the implementation of projects, and we are honest about, is it successful or not in the early phases, and if it's not, we don't go ahead with, you know, if you were to restore a site and leave all the thatch on and spend $1 million, it would be pretty dumb, because you would fail, right? And so you have to find a way that works, and so these preliminary trials are always research and development and then applying them at a larger scale. Even the sites I've been restoring, they started out as 10-acre sites and then 50-acre sites, and now we're up to 192-acre sites, and maybe we'll be at 1,000-acre sites if there are some of those around. But, you know, so it's just that constantly developing that methodology. And I think that other people are borrowing from me and are applying this elsewhere, and I borrow ideas from other people when that's what the scientific literature is about, and that's what journals are about, and things like that. You read about what succeeded, but also journals will write up, well, we tried this and it failed, so that other people don't have to try it and fail again. Right?
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. So here's just some of the site going through. You can see even the track marks, sites going through the kind of green up, but you see how exposed the peat is, and then you get this germination and establishment of pretty diverse vegetation. Here's some of the precision kind of herbiciding that we do. So we document, so we are using herbicide in some places. We document lines in the landscape where it's mostly native vegetation, and here's where it's mostly invasive vegetation, and that might be along a topographic or a hydrologic gradient. We go out with an amphibious machine and we spray a line of herbicide in. But to do that over the rest of this area would be too costly, so then I don't have a photo of it, but we have a helicopter come in after this browns out, and they fly about 10 feet off the ground and spray everything else on this side of the line and avoid everything else on this side of the line. And we did that pretty successfully. We get incredible green up, and I don't know if you can tell, but these are the wiregrass sedges, and they're all in abundant flower, especially up front. I've walked this site for a decade and have not seen these things flower. Just by getting that thatch off and getting the sun down to that peat and heating up the peat, it triggers the plants. They know it's a good time to flower. And then, like I said, once we get that all cleared off, then we manage with fire through time. We get that germination. We get rare things like the twisted yellow-eyed grass seedling up there and flowering, sundews and sedges and things like that. Hundreds of species coming up, all kinds of odd little things. And lastly, I have a drone now. It's actually my second one. They just keep getting better. But this year I flew a drone, and this is a mosaic, just like they do like on Mars and NASA. I mean, you have to fly it pretty darn high to get one shot of the whole site. So what I do is I fly it in strips and like this, and then splice those photos together in Photoshop, and then overlay that photo on the Earth's surface. And what's unreal to me is that year after year, each year I can have a photograph of the site from an aerial perspective of what areas are treated. So here's the herbicided areas, that kind of wet meadow area. What sites are kind of responding. Here's the fen areas where there's still trees up, like along here where we wanted to take the trees down, and where the trees are gone, and anything else. And it's such a high resolution tool, like a 4K drone, that you get such great detail and color and texture and whatever. You can really do some great work interpreting. And then we use that for the monitoring plan and for reporting to the agencies about the bank and how it's responding and things like that. So we have these kind of resources to us. I might flip back to this, but I want to get to kind of what can Spring Lake Park High School students do to assist? How can you assist in the moving into the future? If you as a class or you as an individual are interested in working with Rebecca or me, there's a lot of things that you could help with. well, I'm gonna have Rebecca, I'm kinda starting to lose my voice, thank God. Hydrology, vegetation, wildlife use, data collection, peat depths, invasive species plant coverage, and rare plant locations as those start to pop up out of the seed bank or expand from their existing, kind of what is the location and extent of the rare species and things like that. I'll go back to this slide. So one of the things that I have, and I know Rebecca's got some other ideas, is that what I'd like to do, whether it's with your class or any of you as individuals or other classes, is set up a grid in the GIS of this entire site, maybe on every 200 feet, because that's, you know, like every 200 feet on a grid, and then go out and do monitoring, whether on, you know, a transect to start or a portion of this site, the center, and get peat depths, level of saturation, and notes on the vegetation quality, like is it invasive plants or is it, you know, sedges or native or that kind of thing. And then you can be able to make maps, interpolate between those points, and basically start to do maps over time on how the site is establishing and changing over time, and what the depth of the sand is underneath the peat, and those types of things. And then correlate those things. So you could say that saturated areas tend to support this type of vegetation, or inundated areas tend to support this type of vegetation, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be really useful. You wouldn't have to do it all. You could do a subset of the points. We could do that with Garmin, just Garmin GPS and like tile probes and just regular easy equipment, that kind of stuff. You had some ideas about wildlife?
Ideas also. That one would be extremely useful for the city and help us with our permitting, for our monitoring every year. Some other things that we've identified as a need for, and I believe we've talked a little bit about this when you've been out at the site, is there is a huge diversity of birds out at this site that haven't been documented. What we've heard from people who are avid birders is we're seeing bird populations that haven't been in this area in 20, 30 years. So getting some ideas of the type of birds. What's difficult with birds is they fly around, right? But to get some kind of gauge of what's out there, a big thing with that is breeding birds. Does anyone know what a breeding bird is? It's the type of birds that have their nests in this area. We know killdeers have their nests out here. We know woodpeckers have their nests out here. There's some hawks. But getting a better handle on what type of bird populations are out in this area. Dragonflies. We have also seen a large influx of different types of dragonflies. We're finding out more and more how important it is to preserve our environment for our pollinator species. Our dragonflies, we learned about our mosquitoes. Who would have thought mosquitoes were pollinators? But we need those. We need our bee populations, all those different insects, trying to figure out what's out there, what's significant about them, how they're helping our pollinators and our environment. I believe you saw the slide that talked about the number of threatened and endangered species in the state of Minnesota. We have vertebrate populations and we have invertebrate populations. We know some of those are out at this site, but we haven't had any time to do any research on what's out there. So some of this is taking water samples and taking a microscope or, you know, whatever you have available to you and trying to document what's in the water. We'll see what types of different larvae are out there to find out what other populations of species are going to be out there. So those were a lot of the ideas that Jason and I had. He had educational opportunities. You know, it might be fun. I don't know if anyone is interested in working with little kids. We bring kid groups out there quite a bit, and it's always nice to have additional help. Helping kids, they take water samples and they look at things for you. You know, they look up to you as 17, 18-year-olds to be helping them and working with them to do some of this stuff. So if that's ever an interest, we have programs like that throughout the year. The city has a lot of programs scheduled with the Wargo Nature Center. Are any of you familiar with that center? It's in Lino Lakes area, but they have naturalists that come out and do programming. And so having the opportunity to come and learn some of the stuff from them and then being able to use it in your classwork. So those are a lot of the ideas that we came up with for opportunities for your class to get more involved and working with us. And then I did bring a water trivia quiz.
Oh, heck yeah.
There we go.
And I could, we only have about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I didn't know the answers to them.
No.
So,
There's a
how many of you live in Blaine? I think I've asked you this before, but, okay. So, I apologize, a lot of the questions are more Blaine related since I represent the city of Blaine, but they are helpful for this area. You can work in teams.
Oh, thank God. All right, Sammy boy.
They're front and
I
back.
don't even play. Oh, man. What? Water tip. Oh, we already knew this. Oh, isn't it like Rice Creek? Thanks.
Speak up, Cassidy.
You guys have about 5 minutes, and then we'll go through the answers. If we can get them handed out in time here. If we can't get through all of it, I'll leave the answer key with Mr. Stern.
Oh, I hope there's a true or false in the back. Hey.
You guys need help handing these out?
What? Water flowing streams during dry periods. Water flows in streams during dry periods.
If you want, otherwise you can work in teams.
Kevin told me it was bad. He told me I was like.
Thank you. Okay, wet watershed is in here.
Well, and I'll send it to you. Or I can give it to you when I'm done.
It's top secret.
It's top secret. Oh, you kept passing it. I wasn't sure if you were going to work as a team or. Here you go.
So we have 5 minutes max.
5 minutes. Ah!
Go, go, go.
Yes, yes. Yes. There you go. Wait, are we supposed to count? True, false?
True, false.
Okay. Blood stroll. Yeah. They all do that. Habitat for children. Yes. Recreation. Yeah. Recycling doesn't say that anymore. Well, I know from my knowledge, it's AP testing.
How much water does
No, isn't it? I'm gonna go with true. But if we can also decide substance? How much water? Yeah, like oxygen? It's pretty common. 25. Wait, hold on. Devin's looking. How many gallons? That is 75. I think gallons of water. That's just
How we doing? We got 1 minute. Don't worry, you won't get like any bad score if you don't know them.
okay. And I think it's one.
So yeah, so April was
Two, or is that
some of that
Ah!
probing.
Got the Blaine.
Ah!
Or on a transact.
Definitely one. It's definitely one.
Later, figured out, okay, maybe we're gonna do a transact.
Two.
West and one to the south.
Blade is huge. I'm gonna go
So that you have
Oh, okay, so I'm
rather than just college.
how much water is used in
Are we almost done?
Yeah.
All right. Time. All right.
Stick crows in the ground and like.
Ready? Okay, question number 1. Which watershed district is Spring Lake Park High School in?
Rice Creek.
Correct.
Yes.
So how much water do you think it takes to make a pair of cotton jeans?
32.
Nope.
100 gallons.
Nope. Nope.
1,000.
Nope.
4,000.
1,800. How about a pound of hamburger?
32.
Nope.
That's a 100.
Nope.
4,000.
4,000. Yep.
Dang.
And how about a 12-ounce can of pop? Think 12-ounce can of pop. How much water? Yeah, 16.5. How about 40 sheets of paper? No? No? Back there, you guys have a guess? 2,000? No? 100.
Wow.
All right. 2-pound bread loaf.
Bread of loaf.
1,000, yeah? A ton of finished steel used to make a car. 32, yeah, that's a big one. Daily, how much water does the average American directly use in their home? nope. 50. Yep. How many gallons of water are used in the United States every day?
40 million.
Nope.
300.
How much?
300.
Nope. 400. 400 billion gallons of water are used in the U.S. every day. That's a lot of water. How much of your home's water on average do your toilets use?
20%.
40%. And how many miles of ditches do you think are in the city of Blaine? Think of that big ditch that goes through the
100
wetland
miles.
sanctuary.
30 miles.
30.
That one, guys.
That's like
How
30
deep do you
minutes.
think the deepest well in the city of Blaine is? 741. Yeah. And how many lakes do you think are in the city of Blaine?
5.
One.
One. What's his name? Every other water body in the city of Blaine was man-made. Laddie Lake is the only natural lake in the city of Blaine. How many water towers are in Blaine?
3.
2.
4.
Yay!
And how much water is used in Blaine in one day? Nope.
6.9.
Nope. 6.9.
Hey, I got 2 right there.
All right, last. Got 2 more minutes. True or false? Water that flows in streams during dry periods. Is because of groundwater seeping into the stream.
True.
Or false? True. Yep.
Read your textbook, Cassidy.
All rivers flow to the ocean. True or false? False. And your brain is 3/4 water. Correct or false? True. True. 97% of all water on Earth is found in the ocean.
True. True.
False. Recycling doesn't save any water. True.
Really?
What?
It saves other resources. Water is the most common substance on the earth.
True.
True.
What of oxygen?
Wetlands provide these functions: flood control, improve our water quality, habitat for fish and wildlife, recreation and drought control. True or false? True. Nice job. We thank you guys very much for sitting through our presentation today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
We'll be in touch. We'll sign all these. Before you leave, if you can, try to push the egg chairs back in the corner, square up these cushy ones, and do the best you can. Thank you, all of you, for coming.
Watch our birds.
See if Dave was
No, I like
Yeah, thanks for the
Nice to
question.
see you.
Yes, you too. Thank you.
See ya.
See
Hey, Mr. Stern.
All right, we'll see you tomorrow. Yeah.
There you go.
So the initial restorations, 5 years, we're finishing up year 2.
Thank you.
So, it might go into like 6
Being good
now.
on it.
And then there's a long-term commitment to manage it with fire from there, and maybe some herbicide. So that's like in perpetuity.
Orchids are
but at least
like my
for
favorite
20
flower,
years.
but those are
Are
not
they?
pretty.
Ah, okay. All
They're
right.
pretty.
But they're cool.
Yeah.
So let's.
It's just trying to figure out a way to have it be a thing, like, and that had to do a lot with the wetland banking, generating some credits that can be sold for money.
Right.
Not a good one.
Because the project probably costs about $1 million, but it's
Just a
gonna
reminder, students, that there's an informational meeting today for the Panthers speech team.
so you
Any and
have
all
to be able
students are
to have
able to be a part of it, please attend the meeting at 3:10 in the Senate Hall multi-purpose room that's right to the back side of the cafeteria and the science wing. Once again, informational meeting today for the Panthers speech team.